Welcome to Mid-Century Living, your weekly nostalgia podcast about the best of technology and culture from the mid-20th century.
Welcome to Mid-Century Living, the show where we talk all about the best of the mid-20th century and how to add vintage vibes to your modern life. We are your hosts, Gonzalo
and Jackie. Thank you for joining us today.
In today's episode, we're going to talk about NASA. But before we get into it, how was your week?
My week was great, but unfortunately I don't have anything really interesting or vintage to share today. How about you? How was your week?
So my week was good. It was a long week at work, but I had a really cool moment because I happened to be walking by the principal's office at my school, and we had a guest at the building, and I was talking to someone else, another teacher, and I made a comment about where I graduated and when I graduated from that school. And they're like, you know that the principal is here. And I go, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, this. And then like they walked me over to where this other teacher was. And it happens to be one of the principals from my high school, where I went to high school. And she was instrumental in helping me be involved with a lot of the senior activities and graduation, because I actually graduated early and the district wanted me to walk in December. And this principal, Mrs. Baker, she kind of like, what's the word? Advocated for me to be able to be involved in all the activities that seniors get to be involved, because it's a huge part of being a senior in high school. So I actually got to thank her for doing all that for me. That was a pretty cool moment.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah. So thank your teachers.
Yeah, thank your teachers. I'm glad you got to have that moment. What a small world.
I know. It was very small. But yes. Yeah, it was a little fun moment. So Jackie, many kids grew up with a vision or a wish to be an astronaut when they grew up. Did you ever want to be an astronaut or go to space?
No, I am a giant baby, and I have always been a giant baby, and I've never wanted to go to space. But being a child of the 90s, there was a lot of, like, space camp content. I remember watching on TV as a kid, and I always thought that looked super fun. Like, they put you in the chair that, like, spins upside down and stuff, and, like, Nickelodeon made it seem like that was the most fun thing you could do in the summer, which I never did, but I always thought that looked kind of cool. But no, I've never wanted to go to space. I get motion sickness, and I don't think I could handle it. How about you?
I don't think I ever wanted to be an astronaut, but I did want to be a pilot, which is why I learned to fly a plane. So even though it turned out it wasn't a career for me, I still learned it, and it's been a lot of fun.
I think that's cool that you actually went out and did that, by the way. Like, most people who want to be an astronaut or want to be a pilot just become a banker or whatever instead. So good for you.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, I learned to fly a plane, and even though we're not talking about planes or indeed astronauts really, we are talking about flying, and we're talking about space because, again, we're talking about NASA. And this hopefully is the first of a suite of episodes about mid-century space exploration and space-related activities.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So first things first, what is NASA? How is it related to the mid-century? We should probably start with the first thing. NASA is an acronym. It stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which, for those of you listening to us from outside of the USA, it's a government department that researches and studies everything that has to do with the, quote, last frontier, or also known as outer space. So quick pre-NASA, pre-mid-century quick history on this. So because I'm a history teacher, I have to say something about history, right? The first propulsion systems were used as early as the 10th century by the Song dynasty of China. And the first liquid-fueled rocket ever launched was launched by American Robert H. Goddard in 1926, which is before our podcast.
But really cool.
Yeah. But what really kind of threw us into space was the first rocket to reach space, which was actually sent out by a German. And this, I don't speak German, but it is the Waffle 2, also known as the V2 rocket, which was tested in 1944, which means it was tested by Nazi Germany as a, quote, vengeance weapon designed to attack Allied cities as retaliation for the Allies bombing German cities. So, due to World War II happening, everyone was creating new technology to attack and monitor the enemy. So, in the USA, various branches of the military were conducting research onto things like jet propulsion, satellites, that kind of stuff. But the problem is that everybody wants to do it, but there's no single department in charge. So, if everyone's in charge, no one's in charge.
Indeed.
And here is where NASA really begins in the mid-century. So believe it or not, it begins in Russia, because Russia launched the first artificial Earth satellite. And again, we're not a technical podcast, so for our context, satellite is an object placed into orbit around a celestial body, and they can be natural or man-made. But Russia launched the first Earth satellite called Sputnik 1 on the 4th of October 1957, and it was in orbit for 3 months until it fell back into the atmosphere on the 4th of January 1958.
Oh.
And Sputnik is Russian for satellite when you put it in the context of space. If you put it in the context of something else, it can mean spouse or traveling companion, which I think is still kind of applicable.
That's interesting. Yeah, because it's like traveling with the celestial body. It's orbiting around. Cute.
And this was a small polished sphere about 23 inches in diameter with 4 external radio antennas that broadcasted to Earth and could be even picked up by amateur operators. But the real thing that started it, or started NASA, I should say, is that the satellite's success was a shock to the USA at a time where it was involved in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So it kind of like pushed us to do some more.
Yeah, because Russia made it to space first. We had to make it to the moon first, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yes.
Also, this is the inspiration for the chandelier I have in my kitchen.
Is it really?
Yeah, that's why it's called a Sputnik, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. So NASA came about in a big part as a result of Sputnik's success. And really, it started with the US government enacting Federal Statute Public Law 85-568, which is a technical name for the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which established NASA and was signed by President Eisenhower on July 29th, 1958. And this charged the new agency with, quote, conducting the aeronautical and space activities of the United States, end quote. So NASA effectively became the US's civil space lead and the Air Force its military space lead. So interesting, Sputnik not only launched NASA, but also helped spur the beginnings of the space race, that competition between the USA and the USSR or the Soviet Union to achieve spaceflight superiority during the Cold War.
Indeed.
So one of the first programs that NASA came out with, which was really started by the US Air Force right before NASA was officially created, was called Project Mercury. And it was a mission to put a man into Earth orbit and have him return home safely. Ideally, before Russia did the same thing. There were 20 uncrewed flights. Yes, some did use animals. And 6 successful flights with astronauts between 1958 and 1963. And this included what we call the Mercury 7, which were a group of 7 astronauts who were selected for space flight under Project Mercury.
Do you have anything in here about how you become an astronaut? Where do they come from? Are they like selected like Imagineers from like being really good in their field somewhere else? Or do you have to, is it like the military where you sign up like the FBI or?
So now it's more like a career planning that you do, like in high school and college where you are planning to be something and you work towards that with whatever degree you need. So astronauts today can be specialized or experts, I should say, in a specific field, which they then use when training to be in outer space. So you could be an expert in I want to say herbology, but that's like Harry Potter thing. There's a better word for that. Agriculture, I guess you could say. Um, and then you could use that as a way to research how plants could grow in space.
Intriguing.
Yeah. But back then, it was probably more people in the Air Force who have piloting experience, who are somehow the best at their respective jobs.
Neat. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I should have looked into that before the thing, because now I'm curious.
No, that's fine. The 7 astronauts, and that was announced on April 9th, 1959. And although the Soviet Union really won this race, they were the first to put a man into orbit, uh, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin on April 12th, 1961. The USA followed on May 5th with the successful launch of astronaut Alan Shepard. And both nations kept pushing until May 1963, when the Mercury program ended, and each nation had placed 6 people in space.
So we were tied on people.
We were tied on people, but the USA was behind Russia in spaceflight hours. They had more hours out in orbit.
Interesting.
The Project Mercury space capsule was designed by McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, who merged in 1967 with the Douglas Aircraft Company to create the McDonnell Douglas Company. And they're the ones who created one of the first passenger jet planes, the DC-8. So if that is interesting to you, I suggest tuning into episode 3, The Jet Engine and the Golden Age of Flying, for more information on McDonnell Douglas and the jet engine and
Yeah.
DC-8.
Very good idea.
So the capsule was a 25.9 foot cone-shaped capsule with 100 cubic feet of habitable volume and over 120 controls inside to maneuver the ship. So if you thought driving your car was difficult, try parking the space capsule at the grocery store. Anyway, so that was the first thing that NASA did. Obviously, it was a success. So with that success, that led into the creation of the next big project called Project Gemini between 1961 and 1966. And the aim of this program was to develop practices and perfect techniques for spaceflight to be used in another program that NASA was developing, the Apollo program. So tease for a future episode.
Yeah. That would be a good one.
Yeah. So the result of Project Gemini was the ability of the USA to overcome its Russian counterparts to take the lead in human spaceflight. But really what it did was lead to an understanding of the endurance of the human body in orbit, because we were able to have someone in orbit for up to 14 days. It helped create methods for performing extravehicular activity, which means when the astronaut is outside the ship, and also helped docking or helped create techniques for docking with another spacecraft, which is something that was very important for the Apollo program. So basically, it allowed Apollo program to develop its missions without having to waste time in developing how they're going to do things.
Cool. Yeah, just did all the research for it.
Yeah. All missions launched from the launch complex at Cape Kennedy Air Force Station in Florida in a modified intercontinental ballistic missile. But it's also the first mission to use Mission Control Center in Houston at the Manned Spacecraft Center. And I had to bring that in because Houston. Yeah. So the Gemini program led to the Apollo program. So following the initial success of placing a man in low Earth orbit, NASA then turned to a new goal, which was putting a man on the moon. And there's a lot to the Apollo program. So let's just summarize it like this. We set a goal. We met said goal. Tune in to our future podcast to hear more about the Apollo program.
Excellent teaser.
And during the 1960s, NASA also started a space science and interplanetary probe program, also known as the Mariner program, to launch probes into Venus, Mars, and Mercury, with the goal to explore our nearby planets.
Neat.
So kind of towards the end of the mid-century here, the Space Shuttle Orbiter got started, and that's 1969, where NASA started the Space Shuttle program at Johnson Space Center.
Hey, that's in Houston.
Yep.
Or should I say, hey, that's in Houston too?
Yep. So this was the beginning of an orbiter or a space plane that could be used to explore space and return home safely.
I love the word space plane.
Yeah, that is also it's like Electrovair. So although this program was started in the mid-century, its actual development happened during the 1970s, and the first space flight was launched in 1981. So, if you guys would like to hear more about the space orbiter or the shuttle program, send us an email at info.mcliving@gmail.com or a DM on Instagram at MCL Podcast, and maybe we can get a companion episode in the
Good
works.
idea. So that was all very interesting. Like I said, since I'm a scaredy cat and had no desire to go into space, I don't know a lot of details about all of the space exploration. So I found all this really fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think I ever wanted to be an astronaut, but like I said earlier, I wanted to be a pilot. And I think the big difference for me is that if I equate it with flying over water. I don't like flying over water because if I'm flying a plane, I want to be able to see where I could potentially land if there's an issue. So like over water, you can't because there's no land near you. And I think that's the same reason why I chose pilot over astronaut, because if you're out in outer space, it's a lot more involved to make it back into Earth than it is if you are 5,000 feet above the ground.
Yeah, I gotta say, like, even though I personally do not have this kind of sense of adventure in me, I have huge respect for the people who do. I think that this is like it's fascinating and space is so big and huge and terrifying that like I think it's very impressive that people are brave enough to do it at all. It's just so I have a lot of respect for it. So this is really neat. So how
Yeah.
has NASA impacted us today?
So interesting you ask, because outside of the mid-century, NASA has continued to explore this last frontier. The Mariner program of space probes I talked about earlier continued its work into the 1970s, to be followed by the Viking program,
Very cool.
which successfully landed 2 missions on Mars. I should say unmanned missions on Mars. And this exploration was followed into the 1990s as NASA sent out the first Mars rover, the Sojourner.
Sojourner?
How do you say that?
Sojourner. Sojourner. Where do you put the emphasis? I'm not sure. Too many vowels.
I have no clue. So space exploration kept going into the 1990s as NASA sent out the first Mars rover, and in 2001 launched the Mars Odyssey orbiter, which
Cool.
reached the planet in 2004. And along with that, they've also been sending out more interplanetary probes to understand the planets near us in our solar system. The Messenger, which went out to Mercury in 2004, Pioneer 11 to Jupiter, and the Voyager program to conduct flybys of Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus.
Teehee. I know, you said it the British way, which was good because you're the only one of us who could pull that off.
So, following this exploration, NASA started the Constellation program, which lasted from 2005 through 2009 and had a mission to complete the International Space Station and return to the moon no later than 2020. But unfortunately, this program was ended in 2010 in order to keep NASA's annual funding consistent with what it was receiving in previous decades. So in reality, what happened was a change of previous plans to return to the moon and eventually Mars, the canceling of the development of existing programs and instead turning to the development of a new spacecraft called the Orion, and the expansion of NASA contracts to include works with SpaceX and Boeing, aiming to launch payloads and ferry crew members to the International Space Station instead of paying Russia to do it for us.
So basically, NASA realized that they needed more money and resources than they had to continue exploring space the way that they wanted to, so they started partnering with private companies.
Correct. And one of those companies is SpaceX, which is a company started by Elon Musk of Tesla fame. If you guys listened to our electric vehicle episode 15, which gained worldwide attention for being the only private company who has sent a spacecraft into low Earth orbit and is capable of returning it.
I love that clarification that End is capable of returning it, because it implies that there's a bunch of people trying to like launch stuff into space. Like you can get it to space, the trick is getting it back from space.
Yeah, and I think that's really the big issue. Is like you can launch anything out, but how do you get it back?
Yeah, that's the hard part.
So SpaceX also sent cargo to the International Space Station, and in 2020 became the first private company to send humans into space. And
Is that the company that sorry, I keep interrupting. Is that how William Shatner got to space on a SpaceX flight?
I was unaware that William Shatner made it to space.
Yeah, no, he actually went on one of those little orbit flights. And it changed his whole life. I don't have any of like the quotes on hand, but it was apparently this really moving moment to actually go to space. Yeah, William Shatner went to space. I think it was probably on a SpaceX flight, but I
had no idea.
did not fact check that first.
So at the time of this recording, SpaceX has 298 total launches, 262 total landings, and 233 total reflights.
Intriguing. Well, I think all of that is fascinating, and I'm really excited to see what all of these space explorers do next.
I like the way that you said space explorers, because I do think that NASA and other space exploration entities in other governments are the only ones who should use the word astronaut by name.
Huh.
Yeah, and so both Oxford and Merriam-Webster define astronaut as someone whose job it is to travel and work beyond Earth's atmosphere. So just because you can go on a trip to space doesn't make you an astronaut, right? You can be a space explorer or any other title, but if you're not doing it as your job, then should it be an astronaut?
Intriguing. So yeah, William Shatner doesn't count. Like he's not an astronaut now.
Not an astronaut, yeah, exactly. And the only reason why I think that is because I make it to me, it's like when like I study architecture, so legally I wasn't able to call myself an architect unless I also got licensed, right? We need to pass 6 licensing tests and do like 5 years worth of interning before you could apply for the test. So like it's the same feeling I get when I hear someone who's not in architecture call themselves an architect, like a data or security architect, which I
Right.
get they're building things, right? But like part of me is like, no, it's so hard for someone who studies architecture to call themselves an architect.
Right.
That it's like it's just the prestige in the word, really. The prestige in the word astronaut is what I'm getting to.
Yeah, I think, space explorer might sound too cute, so maybe they'll come up with another word now that more people are doing it. But what else do you call someone who's been to space?
We don't have a word for it.
We don't have a word for that yet. I like space explorer, but I also prefer the like cutesy version of any naming convention, so that's why they're not asking me to name them.
Yep. So now that we're caught up to the present, it seems like the perfect place to transition to our etiquette segment. Jackie, do you have one for us today?
I sure do, and it's another tip from Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette from 1957, which, spoiler alert for future episodes, might be the theme of all of our etiquette tips in season 2, because we both happen to find this exact edition separately,
Without
and it is
coordinating.
Yeah, we did not talk about it together. We were just both looking for etiquette tips and ended up both finding this book. So this might be all of our etiquette tips this season. So buckle up. But anyway, so this one is from chapter 24 about social pleasantries. And I thought this one was really handy. So this is what to do if you cannot remember the name of somebody that you've run into in public. No one is ever pleased if you say, "I know your face, but I just can't recall your name." Tactful people who aren't infallible about names work out a technique for coping with these bad moments. If you are warmly greeted by someone whose name, or maybe whose face too, you can't recall, say something harmless such as, "Nice to see you," or "You're looking well." Then, while looking quite attentive, let the other person do the talking until he or she gives a clue as to identify. which is really the main advice there. Let us hope he doesn't ever say, "You don't remember me, do you?" For your own expression should always indicate you remember him well and favorably. So the official etiquette tip is fake
I
it till
had
you
that
make
happen
it.
to
I
me
believe
once.
that's what she's saying that you should do. If you have trouble remembering the names that match the faces, always help out the other person who is probably suffering from the same thing. Never say, "Do you remember me?" or "You don't know who I am, do you?" Instead, in greeting people you haven't seen for some time, or whom you are meeting outside of your usual place of encounter, identify yourself quickly and gracefully. "How do you do, Mr. Burton? I'm Joseph Bye of Arbor Mills. We did a little business together last fall." Or when a woman has stopped and is obviously confused as to who you are, say, "I'm Joseph, Miss Fox. We see each other at the advertising club." It is certainly more modest and tactful to assume you aren't remembered than to presume that you are.
I like that. Because I've definitely been on the receiving end of, um, you don't know who I am, do you? And it was embarrassing for both of us.
I love that she ties it around and like puts the onus on both parties. Like if you don't remember them, they might not remember you either. So there's something for every situation here.
Yeah, no, I like that too. And then I never thought about that. I'm always like when I see someone and they like recognize me or like they'll talk to me and like I've got no idea who they are, I'm always thinking I'm the only one who doesn't know who they are.
Because that's true. Like sometimes someone will walk up to you at a party and they'll say hi because they know your face.
Uh-huh.
And they like know they should know you. So if you realize you're entering into that awkward situation, why not just be the first one to be like, "Hey, I'm Jackie. You know me from we met at the blah blah blah." Like just do it first and get it out of there. Like I think that's great advice.
No, I agree. I would say I like this. I'm gonna go ahead and vote that we keep this because I already know I'm going to be using this.
Yeah, this is super useful. So this was a fun little tidbit to find, and I'm excited about a whole season of useful tidbits like this from the same book.
I know.
So I believe that one gets the Mid-Century Living seal of approval as well.
I think it does.
Fabulous.
Yes. So it looks like we have landed the plane, or should I say, it looks like we have landed the space orbiter. Thank you guys all for listening today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show and tell a friend.
You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. This is actually the best place to send us feedback and episode suggestions, so send us a DM anytime.
And thank you guys for listening again. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye!
Thank you for listening to Mid-Century Living. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. See you next Friday.